Thank you. I'm delighted to be asked to be here, and I am completely thrilled to see a number of colleagues and friends in the audience today, and I'm delighted to be able to give you this presentation. I hope most of you in the audience are old enough to remember the Blue Bonnet margarine ad, from which I take my title. So I was in Bandung, which is the capital of Central Java in Indonesia, and I was having a wonderful lunch in a delightful restaurant, and I walked into the gift shop hoping to find batik in ikat fabrics and wayang kulit, the shadow puppets, and I found really crappy versions of those things, and then I came upon this, and I was immensely disturbed. I have 1/64th native ancestry, which I know does not give me agency to play a race card in any way, shape, or form, but I saw this and it sent me onto a journey which involved discovering about cultural appropriation, certainly, but about Orientalism, about what the Silk Road had to say about that, about what Said had to say that, and was cultural appropriation possible in a non-Western country? And all of these things went through my head, which put me on the journey which we're about to look at. The Indian head penny was the first example, I think, of the cultural appropriation of the war bonnet, and it was first minted at 1859, and the irony is this appropriation of the war bonnet came before the Wounded Knee Massacre and other forms of genocide, and only makes it, I think, more ironic and more an appropriation. But by the time we get to the 1920s, we have agencies like the Pendleton Woolen Mills, which were actually working with Indian designers and were trying to celebrate Indian culture. In this instance, Nez Perce Designs. This company, Mallinson, created the Sioux war bonnet print in the 1920s, and at first glance, you might look at this and think, okay, this is a bad form of appropriation. But actually, the Mallinson series, American Indian series, was intended to create an American art form in resistance to European things, and it wanted to actually promote an American fashion aesthetic, and that's how it came to be. Of course, we also, at the same time, have images like this, which we see a woman that looks sort of like a Broadway showgirl with her hide clothing falling off of her body, and she's got ceramics that come from another culture and shouldn't be wearing the war bonnet at all. Here we have a Pulp Fiction cover, which I find to be about as profoundly offensive as anything could be. Is particularly the title, Love with Reservations. Now, this is an extremely famous moment of appropriation. Paul Frank's Neon Night Powwow at the Los Angeles Fashion Night Out in 2012. And I do have to say, in Paul Frank's defense, that the follow-up apology that came was actually cited by Adrienne King in her blog as being an excellent example of apologizing, and I commend them for that. I do not commend Victoria's Secret for this. This is a moment that's probably familiar to virtually everyone in the audience, and I also find it kind of incredible that the stylist didn't really know the difference between the Plains Indians in terms of the bonnet and the Southwestern Indians in terms of the accessories, which is either offensive or ignorant, or I think both at the same time. I'm going to go so far as to say that. With this sort of thing, it kind of solidified Victoria's Secret's continued appropriations. This isn't the first gaffe they've made. This isn't the last gaffe they've made. This is one of several things they've done that have been in a highly offensive, appropriative manner, but this one is the one that's most salient to our discussion today. Now, what many of you don't realize, perhaps, is that John Galliano bested Victoria's Secret nearly 20 years earlier with this collection, which got nearly no amount of controversy compared to what happened at Victoria's Secret, even commemorated in a collectible doll. Okay. Now, Abercrombie and Fitch is a company I don't think much of. Now, I don't think much of them because of their horrifying labor practices, but their War Bonnet shirts, I have to say, add insult to injury. They claim they're based on high school sports logos. I find them offensive. And this is my friend Jake, who owns one of these shirts. Now, Jake is from the Philippines, and I spoke to a mutual friend of ours, and I said, how do I explain to Jake that this shirt is offensive? And her rationale to me was, you don't bring it up. Jake is from the Philippines. Both the Filipinos and the American Indians were subjugated by both the Spanish and white Europeans, so you leave it alone. And I had a problem with that rationale. And finally, after a lot of soul searching, I told Jake that I found his shirt was offensive. I think Jake still wears it, but he did agree to let me use his picture today. And he also knows what I'm going to be talking about today. So often, the exchange of cultures is something that we completely cannot avoid. And here what we're looking at is an example of cultural exchange on a commercial level where McDonald's has marketed specifically to the multiracial and multi-ethnic culture of Singapore. Now, I'm gonna say, I've eaten this food and the durian McFlurry is really yummy. And I also really like the halal double rendang burger as well. But sometimes when cultures mix, cultures just mix. And we can't necessarily call it appropriation, it's just what happens. I look around this room, I see people from all races. I think that's exciting, and everybody brings something. In Singapore, we have a wide variety of different races and cultures that are all living together on this small island culture. Sometimes I get accused of cultural appropriation when I wear shirts from Indonesia. Now, Indonesian and Malaysian textiles is one of the specialties of my research, and usually the shirts I wear are gifts from designers or even diplomats. I'm wearing an Indonesian shirt today, so I don't understand why this is appropriation because I'm appreciating it. But sometimes these terms are getting tossed around. I think we all know that. I think that's what today is about. And I went to the internet to research what cultural appropriation meant after I got back from Southeast Asia. I found this quote. Now, this quote was not from a web, a netizen posting on a thread. This quote was actually from an article with a byline. I found this quote perhaps was going a little bit too far in terms of defining what appropriation was. So I decided to look a little bit further. And I also thought about the idea of Halloween costumes. This is me at 2.5, and I'm wearing lederhosen that my grandmother bought in the canton in Switzerland where her grandmother was born. This is my friend Desmond. Desmond is Chinese Malaysian, and Desmond is wearing lederhosen as a Halloween costume. Now, am I allowed to be offended that Desmond is wearing my grandmother's culture as his Halloween costume? I'm going to give you a heads up. I'm not offended by it. I think Desmond looks really cute and goofy, and after all, it's Halloween. But does the hegemonic structure of many cultures have a value in how we assess appropriation, and is the West the only hegemonic culture, and could we consider Asian superpowers like Japan and China to be hegemonic when we take into consideration how we assess what appropriation is? So again, Jake's t-shirt, the menu at McDonald's in Singapore, and now Desmond wearing my grandmother's culture for Halloween made me question things further. And so the next step I took to understand appropriation was I actually went to Wikipedia, I will admit it, and they had some pretty good things to say in the opening of their article. Cultural appropriation is the adoption or use of the elements on culture by members of another culture. And cultural appropriation is sometimes portrayed as harmful, which it is, framed as cultural misappropriation, those are my italics, and claimed to be a violation of the intellectual property rights of the originating culture. Totally true. Often unavoidable when multiple cultures come together, like at Singapore McDonald's. Cultural appropriation can include using other cultures' traditions, fashion, symbols, language, and cultural songs without permission. They continue, according to some critics of the practice, cultural misappropriation differs from acculturation, assimilation, or cultural exchange in that appropriation or misappropriation refers to the adoption of these cultural elements in a colonial manner. Elements are copied from a minority culture by members of a dominant culture, and these elements are used outside of their original cultural context, sometimes even against the expressly stated wishes of the representatives of the originating culture. Frankly, as Wikipedia goes, I don't think they could have said it much better. So let's examine some recent well-publicized incidences of cultural appropriation. Oops, sorry. Oh, yes. I'm sorry, I'm having a horrible time with this remote. Okay. I turned to one of my students at NYU who gave me a very thoughtful viewpoint. Cultures both East and West have been borrowing from each other's styles since contact began, but objects, designs, or symbols of spiritual, religious, cultural, and/or ritual significance should remain commercially untouched. That's where the line is crossed. And I think that this hit it on the nail. And I think we're all familiar with this particular example of the KTZ sweater, something that the moment I saw it, I felt disgusted, I have to say. And I think that many of you are familiar with the Mexican Oaxaca woman's traditional blouse being appropriated by the Paris designer Isabel Marant. Now, when this controversy was unfolding, the argument came out that, well, the Spanish brought the blouses. And you know what? They did. And the embroidery was done with embroidery machines, not hand embroidery, and that's also something that Western culture brought them. However, the symbology in the blouses had spiritual significance. And from that standpoint, it was definitely a model of what my student Olivia had to say. Now, this is a moment that was really unfortunate for the mayor of London. He was opening a Hindu temple, and the Hindu priest was actually the one that dressed him, and he just happened to get caught by the paparazzi with this gesture. Nothing about this was appropriation, yet he had been vilified to some degree because of this moment. So I then took a look at the Silk Road to see how things went back and forth, and we saw Asian hats ending up in Greece, and then we saw Greek drapery ending up in depictions of Buddha, and then we saw how hats from the Scythians and the Phrygians made their way into Tibetan ritual hats, and Greek helmets also making their way into Tibetan ritual hats, and things coming the other way. This took me, of course, to Edward Said, who's, I'm sure you are all familiar with his precepts, and this painting by Jerome and this painting of boys in Persian dress on horses are also representative of these ideas. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because I'm being signaled that we're short on time. So we would like to have time for Q&A, and our time is running short. So throughout this journey of looking at different fashion collections, different forms of Orientalism, Gothic Lolita as a potential form of appropriation led me to my final thoughts. So I do want to wind up without any more time constraint on taking us back to my original moments in Southeast Asia. Okay, I'm at this resort. I'm looking for Indonesian crafts, and I'm confronted with made-in-China dream catchers. And I am already disturbed. I turn the corner and I see this. And it was at this point that my mind kind of went into a place where I didn't want it to go, but it ended up going, where I found myself being profoundly offended by what was going on. Now, the lime green mannequin certainly didn't help, but then I came across these available for sale, and as I traveled in my journey around Southeast Asia on a different purpose, I was doing research on a different element, I kept seeing much of the same thing. These were for sale as if they were like stuffed animal heads that one would hang on the wall, that I found, I was horrified by. And then I make my way to Kota Kinabalu, and I see more made-in-China dream catchers, and then I go to the Denpasar airport in Bali, and I found these dream catchers, which I kind of referred to as gay pride dream catchers, because they got the sort of rainbow thing happening. And more in Denpasar, what I found fascinating about these is that these made-in-China dream catchers were actually being marketed with that floral stand, which is a sacred element in Balinese Hinduism, also for sale. And of course, more war bonnets available for sale in Denpasar. So I took a further look into how the war bonnet was being used in maritime Southeast Asia, and I found this cultural park in Thailand which is kind of like the equivalent of It's a Small World. It was very, very well intentioned, but the combination of a male war bonnet with what was essentially a reproduction of a female hide dress was rather disturbing to me, but the intentions I thought were okay. Now here is an acquaintance of mine, Mr. Nur Alif bin Ismail, who was looking for a Halloween costume in Jakarta, and he was being shown what was called the deluxe Indian chief package, and that's what he got there. And this, which Kathleen mentioned to me when I showed her this picture, looked like Mardi Gras, is a birthday party in Ubud in Bali. And the tiger stripes and the Courage-like go-go boots, they make it all completely whack and insane in my mind. Now, this is what we've sent around the world, right? And I was looking at this image actually just last night, and I realized that the only costume in this group that has any sort of sacred ritual context is the Indian in the war bonnet, and nothing else. It's not like we have a priest in the lineup, right? The war bonnet is the only thing that is of sacred identity. And so we have images like this. This is my friend Chen, and he was going to be emceeing the Borneo Bear pageant in Kota Kinabalu, Malaysia. I'm almost done. And he had been working on his upper body for the last year, and so he went to the costume rental company in Kuala Lumpur, and they said, "We have the perfect thing for you." And I think Chen looks great, you know? And in this instance, we are in Taiwan. We're in Taipei City. This is an LGBT white party, and the war bonnets are actually just kind of being used as accessories, and again, without any real understanding as to why this might be offensive. Now, this is my friend Kai in a Halloween costume in 2012, and I showed this to my class a couple of years ago at NYU, and there was a great deal of discussion about it, and one of my most wonderful critically thinking students, Stephanie Kramer, who now works at the Museum of Modern Art, said, well, maybe, just maybe, we find this less offensive of an appropriation because the young man is attractive. And if he were not attractive, maybe our minds might go to a more offensive place. And I think that's just human nature, but I think she also might be hitting the nail on the head with that. He liked his first war bonnet experience so much that he repeated it the following year. I would have loved to have been able to stop him from it, but I couldn't. So anyway, thank you very much for your attention, and I appreciate the time here. Thanks.